One of my favorite action scenes in film history is the final trench run at the end of the original Star Wars. A New Hope is known for changing the industry and innovating filmmaking techniques, and no sequence embodies that spirit more than the tense 12-minute dogfight above the Death Star. Every technique that ILM pioneered with the first Star Wars was pushed to its limit with this climactic sequence, and despite its long length, it never loses its tension through its razor-sharp editing and masterful escalation of stakes. The characters and vision made Star Wars into the classic it is today, but it was the trench run specifically that got audiences to come back countless times and make it the highest-grossing film of all time. Since then, Star Wars has had many spectacular sword fights and space battles, yet none of them have lived up to the sheer impact of the destruction of the first Death Star. And this isn't from a lack of technological innovations or inspired ideas. One of the bigger disappointments of the Star Wars series is that despite repeatedly going back to the Death Star well, they haven't come close to recapturing the magic of this iconic sequence.
The Force will be with you, always.
You can only blow up the Death Star for the first time once, and each subsequent run came with less fanfare, innovation, and imagination, to the point where it became an obligation for the story, a necessity so that the heroes can live to fight another day. It had me thinking that maybe this sort of sequence had just been played out. The iconography and ridiculously high stakes so familiar that we would feel anything but tension. And then I saw Top Gun Maverick. First off, Top Gun Maverick fucking rules. It's my favorite film of the year and one of the best blockbusters of the last 20 years. It's that good. It deserves every accolade and record it's broken. However, despite being beloved, that doesn't mean it's entirely original. It is a legacy sequel after all. Early on in the film, as Maverick is briefed on the parameters of the mission he will be asked to teach and eventually lead, the entire audience collectively has a realization.
The plant sits in an underground bunker at the end of this valley.
This is just a Death Star run. And it really is. There's going below cover to avoid turrets, a super small target that's just as hard to get to as it is to shoot, enemy fighters on their tail forcing them to fly far more aggressively. It's another Death Star run. And yet, it was one of the most thrilling sequences I've ever seen in a theater, and just like A New Hope 45 years ago, it's the strength of the sequence and how it pays off the rest of the film that has carried Maverick to its unfathomable success. But before we discuss how Tom Cruise and Joseph Kosinski remade the Death Star trench run for the modern age, we first have to discuss between the 11 live-action theatrically released Star Wars films, that's a lot of qualifiers, 4 of them have had climactic sequences that are iterations on the original's climax, and of those 4, Return of the Jedi stands out as the strongest one since the original. What helps Return of the Jedi's climax, especially in comparison to the Star Wars films that followed, is that the structure of the film is built around setting up its central obstacles. We get a briefing at the start of Act 2 on how the new Death Star operates and what its weak points are, and then we spend the rest of the movie following through on these targets, adding complications and twists that up the stakes of the mission.
Well, how could they be jamming us if they don't know if we're coming?
Where the second Death Star run suffers in comparison to the original is how, despite the improvements in visual effects and compositing, it isn't as important to the overall story. The external stakes of the narrative are here, but the emotional and philosophical stakes are missing, instead being present in the final duel between Luke and Vader and the Ewoks attacking the Legion of the Emperor's best troops. It is the backdrop to the main conflict, the ticking clock so that Han, Luke, and Leia can have their big moments and get a view of the fireworks. This issue of the external stakes not lining up with the emotional and philosophical stakes becomes exacerbated in the canonical next installment, The Force Awakens. The driving force of this film isn't Starkiller Base or the Resistance's plan to defeat it, but instead the missing map to Luke Skywalker that all the characters are obsessed with. All of the thematic conflict is tied up with that map to Luke, so when the plotline of Starkiller Base shows up and in 2 minutes rewrites the entire political landscape of the frickin' galaxy, well, it feels shoehorned in and from a different movie. This pivot to focusing on Starkiller Base ultimately hurts the film in the long run, and appears to exist just to give the film a visually exciting climax. The mission that Poe leads really has nothing to do with the conflict between Rey, Finn, Kylo Ren, and Han Solo, and whenever the film cuts away to his mission that we all know will succeed, it takes away from the storyline the audience is actually invested in. The Force Awakens climax is a rather striking comparison to Top Gun Mavericks, not just because both feature missions attacking secret snowy bases, but that the leaders of said missions share a lot in common. Where Maverick is the best pilot at Top Gun, Poe Dameron is the best pilot in the Resistance. Both are confident, brazen, and more than willing to pull off a death-defying maneuver.
That's one hell of a pilot! Woo-hoo!
The issue in Force Awakens' case is that despite giving Poe the most important action in the narrative, it doesn't give him the character or thematic weight to back it up. There are no character flaws for him to overcome, no obstacle he's worried about facing, those are left for the sequel. Instead, he is only the best pilot in the Resistance. On top of that, the actual presentation of the dogfight itself isn't all that special. There are no memorable maneuvers, no major setbacks or strategies. Poe's just waiting in the wings for his moment to shine. The issues with The Force Awakens climax raise an important question. How do you create an action scene for an impossibly talented character and make it thematically and narratively satisfying while also making it fun and thrilling? Well, for starters, if there's one constant among the great climaxes in film history, it's that they make their final missions that our heroes embark on feel impossible. Cruise has committed so much to this idea that his flagship franchise is literally named after it. The entire narrative provides the heroes with stakes, obstacles, facts, and flaws, and then when we, the audience, put all these factors together, it should be impossible for us to see how a good outcome is possible. The narrative then has to prove us wrong without resorting to cheating, surprising us with the outcome, but in a way that feels fair and almost inevitable. It goes without saying that the more you stack the odds, the more on the edge of our seat we'll be when our heroes are in danger. This suspense doesn't come from the unknown or obstacles that come out of nowhere, but instead it comes from telling us exactly what is coming and what miracles they need to perform to overcome them. A New Hope has a 2-minute briefing scene giving us the rundown on what to expect, but Maverick sets up its climax throughout every second of the film. The opening scene is all about Maverick taking a risk to look after his team, pushing his aerial craft and his body to their limit. The exact same thing he'll do during the climax. We are introduced to the mission and its difficulty before we meet any of the candidates who will carry it out, with every scene of them, on the ground and in the air, being a test of their capability to complete it. Laying out every obstacle meticulously throughout the narrative serves two functions within the climax. The first function is that it makes every moment feel earned. Most narratives are tests for our heroes to fail and grow from, but rarely has it ever been so bluntly laid out in the way Maverick does. For the entire movie, we've seen how each character has struggled and developed with each individual obstacle, so when we finally see them carried out convincingly, it gives a level of satisfaction and character to pretty much every single action beat. The second function is to create clear and understandable action. Geography and communication are hard for any action scene, but for flying it can be downright impossible, especially as orientation is changing at every second, with the only frame of reference for spatial awareness being a clear sky or empty terrain. Creating identifiable obstacles that the audience learns by heart does wonders for letting us know exactly what's going on. Instead of spending our mental energy parsing out what's happening on screen, we effortlessly absorb the information and can instead focus our energy on anticipating the obstacles and caring for the characters. Speaking of obstacles, one element that can't be overlooked in making the action thrilling is how the enemy is presented. Because they're so cryptic so as to not piss off any real nation, the design of the enemy can then be made into whatever makes as thrilling of a climax as possible. Whereas every other series has hordes of cannon fodder for our heroes to pick off in droves, Maverick does the rare thing of making each individual enemy more equipped than our heroes. This not only leads to more tense scenarios, but it furthers the narrative of cooperation and communication that the rest of the film has done such a thorough job setting up. We all know how disappointing it is when a villain is hyped up for being badass, and then they're taken out with ease. Thankfully, Maverick is the opposite of this. Despite all the cool shit Maverick and his team do in this finale, it's so relieving that the best maneuver in the entire film goes to the villains.
What the fuck was that?
What makes the action scene work isn't just that it's tense during the moment or that we sense that our heroes are in danger. It's that we knew exactly how difficult it would be ahead of time. The entire conflict of the story is Maverick not wanting to take Rooster on the mission because he knows that someone isn't going to make it home.
No, someone's not coming back from this.
All the prep work throughout the film is about blowing up the base and completing their mission. But making it home in one piece, surviving the onslaught of rockets and incoming 5th generation fighters, is left up to each pilot and their individual talents. It's important that the film stays true to the stakes it sets up. Despite all the training and teamwork they've developed, Maverick knows that someone's not coming back, so he decides that it's going to be him, taking a rocket for Rooster. This moment only carries its weight if we know that it's coming ahead of time, changing the stakes for the second half of the climax. Despite all the similarities on the surface, the biggest link between Top Gun Maverick and A New Hope is how they're masterpieces in staying true to their established stakes, using each one to subvert, build up, and reinvent the others. And when we compare how Maverick pays off its narrative stakes with A New Hope's, we realize... So throughout this video, I've been using the terms external stakes, emotional stakes, and philosophical stakes, and these are terms I've picked up from screenwriter Michael Arndt, who wrote the screenplays for Little Miss Sunshine, Toy Story 3, and coincidentally enough, the first draft for The Force Awakens. He's shared his writing process and philosophies online, and in one of his essays, he talked about how A New Hope's climax is brilliant because of how it ties up all three of its central stakes within its incredible climactic moment. The external stakes are of course resolved when Luke blows up the Death Star, saving the Rebel base, and this accomplishment only happens because of the decision he made earlier in the sequence, using Obi-Wan's advice to use the Force to make the impossible shot. This cements the film's emotional stakes of Luke beginning his path to becoming a Jedi Knight. But the most important element to this scene working is the payoff to the film's philosophical stakes, which is anchored in the relationship between Luke and Han Solo. While they find themselves as instant allies, narratively, the two represent two opposite ends of living within an oppressive dictatorship. Luke is younger and wants to join the fight, but Han? He's seasoned, he has debts to pay and just wants to save his skin. He's heroic, but only when it's convenient for him. Throughout the narrative, we see Luke's optimism ever so slightly get under Han's skin, pushing him to his greatest moments. However, when things get dire, Han skips town, but not before Luke can plant the seed of disappointment, letting him know he could be so much more.
I know what I'm doing.
And when the external stakes of the film are at their most dire, Luke's persistence pays off as Han returns, clearing the field so that Luke can save the day. We root for Luke, but we cheer for Han. Every Death Star battle since has borrowed the iconography and the scale, but none of them have tied their emotional and philosophical stakes to their space battles in the way A New Hope did. But Top Gun Maverick, well, it did more than just borrow. First off, there are two ridiculously identical parallels to A New Hope in Maverick that are so similar I have to assume they're flat-out references. The first is how both films pay off their emotional stakes. The central emotional conflict of the film is the strained relationship between Maverick and Rooster, and how Maverick failed to live up as the surrogate father figure that Rooster needed. On top of that, the character obstacle for Rooster to overcome is that due to how his father died, he flies more conservatively than his peers. The mission requires a strict 2.5-minute timer, and with his style of flying, he just won't make it. Maverick's big decision heading into the climax is to trust in Rooster, but this risk doesn't pay off immediately. As they begin their assault, Rooster starts to fall behind the pack and is at risk of being picked off by the incoming enemy fighters. It's at this point that he reaches out to his father and asks for help.
Talk to me, Dad. Come on, kid, you can do it. Don't think. Just do it.
Y'all realize that's literally use the Force Luke, let go, right? Like, not only is he being told to let go, but he's also metaphorically communicating with a ghost. But on top of being an incredibly funny parallel, both moments serve the same function. They're turning points in the film's emotional stakes. The second direct parallel to A New Hope is the fan favorite Hangman, who serves the exact same function in the story as Han Solo. Both of their names spell out their central flaws that the heroes need to help them overcome. Hangman is infamous at Top Gun for leaving his wingmen out to dry, which is why he doesn't make the assault team despite his tremendous skill. Throughout the second half of the climax, as Maverick and Rooster make their daring escape run, we see Hangman requesting to join the fight and help them out, but he's told by command to stay put. Of course, this is all they set up for him to come out of left field like Han Solo before him and save the day, in a way where he grows in the process while still getting to keep his ego. Each of the climax's big moments, from Maverick taking the hit for Rooster, to Rooster coming back for Maverick, and finally Hangman saving the day for the both of them, are all iterations on the film's overall emphasis on the importance of human fighters. At the start of the narrative, Ed Harris's character promises to Maverick that the days of human pilots are numbered, to which Maverick responds,
Maybe so, sir. But not today.
We see this get put to the test when Maverick and Rooster make their daring escape run on the F-14 fighter jet, which has to be one of the best nostalgia buttons in years. Behind this ancient beast, Maverick and Rooster pull off some awe-inspiring maneuvers and manage to go toe-to-toe with the superior 5th generation fighter jets. But as we explained in the previous chapter, having the F-14 win the day all on its own would be a betrayal of the stakes it had so meticulously set up. This is what makes the Hangman reveal so satisfying, not only because it finally gives him his moment to shine, but because it cements the peril that the characters were actually in. The film can stay true to its impossible stakes because of how and why the characters come in to save the day, each one marked by character growth and thematic importance. Maverick's payoffs don't happen in as tight of a fashion as A New Hope's iconic 2-minute showstopper, but by sprinkling them throughout the entire sequence, I'd argue it makes for a more narratively satisfying experience. And of all the payoffs that happen in the air, my favorite moment in the entire climax has to be the brief moment on the ground when Maverick and Rooster meet up after their crashes.
What the hell were you even thinking? You told me not to think.
The film's philosophical stakes are that trusting in human fighters is the right thing to do, but in Maverick's case, he hasn't been willing to trust in Rooster and let him make his own decisions. But now that he's let him go, Rooster makes the wrong move that goes entirely against Maverick's mission. But by trusting in him and taking his lead, he not only makes it home alive, but also rebuilds his most important connection to the past. All of this narrative and character work from the outside seems easy, but actually tying it all together on top of turning it into a truly electrifying action scene? Well, that's Herculean. The narrative and its ideas are simple, but the mechanics and craft elevating them are endlessly complex, and like A New Hope before it, it's essential studying for the blockbusters of the future. But before we leave, I just have one last quick thing to say. Now, I could have made this video just about Top Gun Maverick, but I think the comparison to the original Star Wars was important, not just because of their similarities, but also the differences between the current state of both series. Star Wars is near and dear to me, and it pains me to see it caged by the limits of Disney+. I don't like the stories they're telling, and I don't like how they're telling them, to the point where I've lost that urge to go back to those original films I fell so deeply in love with. Maverick is a sequel to a film that I never cared for, and still don't really care for, but throughout the entire runtime, I felt that magic that I see in Star Wars, or Raiders, or whatever your frame of reference is. It is pure filmmaking, laser focused on the story it's telling, giving us lovable characters in an uncynical tale about good and evil. It's a story about the past, filmed with methods only possible in the present, and a passion for filmmaking that demands to be seen on the big screen. To me, that's Star Wars. Maverick shows us that the spirit of our classics, they don't belong to those properties. That while the spin-offs and sequels can use the iconography and music cues and characters, they don't own the magic that made those films classics. They know all the lyrics, but have none of the rhythm. Whereas every other franchise is nostalgic for themselves, Top Gun Maverick succeeded because the one thing it's nostalgic for is classical Hollywood storytelling. And if its success is anything to go by, I think we need that now more than ever. Hey everyone, the internet's most consistent creator here. If you want to see more cool videos like this one, make sure to subscribe. There's a lot of really cool stuff coming. Also, if you appreciated my ramblings, follow me on Twitter. Sometimes I form a coherent sentence. I think that's everything, so bye.